results on e-commerce have not really picked up because there is disconnect between how countries want to move forward on many of these issues. So the conversation is pretty much just stagnant at the moment. Although GATS states nothing explicitly about cross-border flow of information, WTO members have been applying GATS and have been applying those frameworks for dispute settlement. So, for example, Mexico telecoms, US gambling, China publications and audiovisual products, and China electronic payments. These are 4 case studies that we have included in the background paper, which hopefully provide a little bit of background to how states are resolving or trying to use the dispute settlement mechanisms that are prevalent in trade bodies to kind of create some sort of standards. In May 1998, the WTO members established the Comprehensive Work Program on Electronic Commerce to examine all trade-related issues relating to global electronic commerce, taking into account the economic, financial, and development needs of developing countries. The 1998 declaration establishing the program also included a statement that members will continue their current practice of not imposing custom duties on electronic transmissions. So another agreement which is of relevance here is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS. The TRIPS agreement deals with domestic procedures and remedies for enforcement of intellectual property rights. It does not specifically cover IPR protection and enforcement in the digital environment, but arguably has application to the digital environment and sets a foundation for IPR provisions in mega regional trade agreements, which we see are being picked up. And many of these agreements also have been exploring TRIPS plus provisions, which is slightly problematic. The Doha member state designed the GATS language to remain unchanged as technology evolves, but certain states now are seeking to clarify points and they want to update these rules. Academics and business leaders have also argued that the WTO's rules are incomplete, out of date, and in need of clarification. Yet other delegations have insisted that no new commitments or disciplines can be negotiated in the framework of the e-commerce work program. The 11th Ministerial Conference, which I'm sure we'll hear from some of the audience members who were there, concluded with no clear path forward on the Doha development agenda, reflecting on the ongoing wide division amongst member states. While the stalling of the Doha round of negotiations, WTO members and experts have raised various options to take these discussions forward, and some of them include updating the rules in the WTO framework to address digital trade, including multilateral GATS to cover cross-border data flows, technology transfer, and greater market access issues. Another suggestion is using existing plurilateral WTO frameworks, such as expanding the ITA, telecommunications, or the trade facilitation agreement. So basically taking what the WTO already has and recrafting it for the digital environment. Another suggestion has been to establish a permanent WTO working group dedicated to exploring digital issues, possibly based on the current e-commerce work program, or to create a new standalone trade agreement specific to data services or digital trade, possibly initially as an open plurilateral deal. And we see some movement on this happening following the recently concluded WTO ministerial in Argentina. Another suggestion has been creating a separate digital trade specific WTO agreement, and e-WTO, as some have suggested. The US Trade Representative Ambassador Froman noted that new rules on critical 21st century issues, such as e-commerce and the digital economy, are emerging. A better path forward is a new form of pragmatic multilateralism, whatever that may mean. In July 2016, the US put forward a submission under the WTO work program on electronic commerce, offering trade-related policies that can contribute meaningfully to the flourishing of trade through electronic and digital means, but without specific negotiating proposals. The non-paper included 16 policies included in the US submission, and you can go through it. We've covered that in the background paper. Similarly, China also put forward a proposal in November 2016 in which it seeks to clarify and to improve the application of existing multilateral trading rules with a focus on facilitating e-commerce. In April 2017, at the sides of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, E-Commerce Week, a group of developing countries calling themselves the Group of Friends of E-Commerce for Development, quite a mouthful, gathered for their first ministerial meeting to reveal a roadmap device to push for the incorporation of e-commerce mandate at the WTO ministerial in 2017. However, this did not move forward. The second part of, so the first part of the background paper basically provides the history of how IG issues have evolved in the WTO framework and how, what are some of the relevant agreements that member states are exploring. The second part of, we cover trade negotiations that have included digital issues, including those that are currently being negotiated. We delve into the status of these negotiations, including the areas where countries have reached consensus and others where negotiations face difficulty, and outline what experts have been saying on this issue. So we cover the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As you may know, the US withdrew, and initially it was a group of 12 countries, including the US. After US's withdrawal, the 11 countries are trying to move ahead with the deal, and there is no agreement on that at the moment. We also cover the Trade and Services Agreement, or TISA. So TISA, it was TISA included 28 European Union nations and several other countries. According to the TISA negotiating framework, the forum is open to all WTO member nations, and they can join the discussion after ratifying the agreement. Again, there is the discussions have stalled at the moment on TISA as well. We also cover the Agreement on Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, between the EU and the US, which began at the same time as the TISA. Several contentious issues remain unresolved, and subsequently negotiations have slowed down to the point where no new negotiation rounds have been scheduled. We cover the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which began in March 2017. It includes US, Canada, and Mexico. The negotiations are expected to rotate between the three countries, and a proposed timeline for agreement has been set for the end of 2018, but based on current progress, this deadline is likely to slip. The idea of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership was initially has been branded as a counter to the TPP because it involves China. But again, there is very little consensus between the nations that are part of the negotiating framework. So if you go through our background paper, we cover at what state of play these negotiations are at the moment, and what some of the positions of the countries are, and where they differ from each other, and what are some of the contentious issues. Part 3 of the background paper, we address some of the emerging themes. So from the WTO framework and from these trade agreements, what are some of the provisions related to digital economy that are being included? And we've created a list, and we've gone into what is the rationality, and how nation states are seeking to push for some of these issues. I'll just quickly name a few of them. So there's paperless trading, custom duties on transmissions, source code disclosure or handing over encryption keys, limits on the review of software source code, net neutrality, spam and malware, patent term extension, data exclusivity for test data, copyright term expansion, digital rights management restrictions, intermediary liability, criminal enforcement and civil damages, dispute settlement mechanisms, trade secrets, domain names, personal information, cross-border data flows, data localization, and financial services. So if you see, there's a whole range of issues that are being included in many of these agreements. And we also kind of provide a background to why these issues are relevant to e-commerce and the digital economy, and why including them in trade agreements, why some of these issues may not be appropriate to be included in trade agreements, and maybe better addressed through conventional internet governance mechanisms that have been working on these issues for a very long time. The final section of the part 4 of the background paper, we highlight some of the procedural inconsistencies between the multi-stakeholder approach, which is followed in internet governance. We provide a broad range of recommendations for introducing transparency and opening up digital trade negotiation processes by governments for the participation by affected stakeholders. So a lot of these, I've been working on this for a year, and it's very difficult, actually in many cases it's impossible to be to follow these discussions because civil society is not part of it, or to influence how these discussions move forward. So the recommendations seek to establish a framework for participation of diverse stakeholders. So the opacity of process associated with trade negotiations is at odds with multi-stakeholder, open, accountable forms of participation. And the adoption of global or regional trade rules needs to be researched and studied from diverse fields to understand the impact of the agreements on internet and the information society. So if you don't have open processes and inputs are not being taken from a wide range of stakeholders, we don't know what is going on, it's very difficult to understand where we will end up in the future. We have had to rely on leaks of many of these proposals, and we've highlighted that if trade agreements are to be used to address internet-related public policy issues, public support for this would appear to be contingent upon the inclusiveness, accountability, and transparency of the negotiations, so that civil society does not feel that it has been excluded. It is also vital to open up trade processes where rules for IG are being negotiated, so that participation can ensure that policies and laws are developed to defend and promote free expression and innovation, rather than just focusing on the economic aspects. So recognizing the considerable social and economic benefits that could flow from the international trading system that is fair, sustainable, democratic, and accountable, a group of expert group of stakeholders came together in 2006 to forge the Brussels Declaration on the Trade and Internet. The stakeholders they represent internet users, consumers, business, cultural institutions, and scholars. The 30 participants at the meeting were selected by EFF based on personal contacts and recommendations. Although most participants were from civil society, the group was rounded out by a small number of private sector participants. The ideas expressed in the declaration have been created to provide a roadmap and means to hold governments accountable. The main demands of the Brussels Declaration include proactive dissemination of information, including regular release of draft proposals and consolidated texts, opportunities for meaningful involvement and collaboration with civil society representatives, applying freedom of information principles to the development and negotiation of government positions, the need for balanced representation on any trade advisory body or processes, affirmative measures to engage organizations and experts representing internet users and consumers, and ensuring that the resulting agreements support realization of the targets of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The participants from the Brussels meeting were amongst the core group who have come together to form the Open Digital Trade Network, which was formed in February 2016. The IGF, Dynamic Coalition on Trade and the Internet, is an extension of the Open Digital Trade Network, aimed at extending the consensus on these recommendations for reform to a broader set of stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. And I'm going to follow on with that. Don't worry, we are going to open this up to the rest of you very soon. And also, people who do participate from the floor get to have a tart, an apple tart. But before that, I'm going to lead you through the resolution that we have been working on this year. So let me just bring it up on. A number of you have been able to pick up a hard copy, but for those who haven't, the version on the screen has also got oops, no, that didn't work.
Number 5.
Okay.
5, and you didn't type 5.
Okay. Nope, 5, yeah. So the short link to this document is listed at the top of the page here. It's goo.gl / as you can see, VI5VMR. But I'm going to read some of the highlights of it. As I said, this has already been, if you're a member of the mailing list, you've already seen this and you've already probably given some comments on it. So I'm not going to go through the preamble, but the preamble is just talking about how there is the possibility of international trade agreements supporting a free and open internet, but there's also risks. And part of the risk is that these agreements are being developed without adequate input from all stakeholders and without adequate transparency. And therefore, we posit a couple of principles. The principles are basically just that there should be transparency and consultation, and then a slightly longer list of recommendations. So the principles, transparency, just that governments have a responsibility to inform their citizens of how they regulate and to receive public comments. Hence, trade negotiators should proactively and regularly disseminate information about negotiations, including draft proposals and consolidated texts, to allow them to meaningfully participate in the negotiation process. And then consultation is that governments conducting trade negotiations have a responsibility to take affirmative measures, again, to ensure that representatives of all interested parties have the opportunity for meaningful involvement. So it doesn't necessarily mean having them in the negotiating room, because that may be a step too far, but at least having a degree of collaboration with government during the development of the text proposals. So those are the two principles, and then the recommendations flow from those, so that the textual proposals put forward by countries should be published. Consolidated text should be published after each round of trade negotiations. That trade ministries should act transparently by publishing records of their meetings with stakeholders, which doesn't mean the content of the meetings, but just the fact that there have been meetings, and should have an independent transparency officer where that's applicable. That there should be domestic consultations on the textual proposals, and that if there are trade advisory bodies, that there's a need to ensure that those are balanced by including diverse legitimate stakeholders, such as representatives of internet users and organisations working in the areas of human rights, development, media and consumer issues. So there's a revision history to this as well. So if you go to the Google Doc, which you can see the revision history, and you can see how this evolved during the course of the year, and a number of comments were quite useful to, like, adding in references to human rights and development, things like that, taking out language that was like dog whistle language to some people that talks about data flows in a way that they don't think is appropriate. So I think what we've ended up with is something that we ought to be able to come to agreement with. But I'm going to open up the floor now to anyone who has comments on this text. If you do not have a hard copy in front of you, then maybe the person nearest you who has one can share it with you. Otherwise, you can check the link here. So does anyone wish to offer any comments on this draft text? Yes, Bill.
Hi, Bill Drake. Jeremy, do we know that this text didn't we develop this in the context of the ODTN?
No.
We developed this in the context of this grouping?
Yeah, so this draws upon the previous work that Jyoti mentioned, which is one of the references at the end here, the Brussels Declaration on Trade and the Internet. So that was an inspiration for this, but this is a little more suitable for like a multi-stakeholder body.
But I mean, my question was, is this a document of the Dynamic Coalition, or is this a document of...
Yeah. So
okay. If it is not the mail list kind of the plenary of the
Yeah, so
Dynamic Coalition? So it'd be
what
approved there, wouldn't it?
So the mailing list has basically endorsed this already, but what we want to do is to say that it was also approved by rough consensus of the inaugural face-to-face meeting of the Dynamic Coalition. So that's what we're saying. And the other reason why we're phrasing it that way is so that if there's particular people in this room who can't add their names individually to a document because they have to get approval from office holders of your organisation or anything like that. By saying that we have rough consensus, that means that you, as an individual, are not implying that you've signed on separately to this. So that's the way we're hoping to do it. And this is kind of a common practice of internet governance, as you know, is to, as long as there are no really strong objections, everyone can pretty much get behind the document, then it can be declared as having been adopted by rough consensus. So that's the plan, but now you have an opportunity, if you do have strong objections, to voice them. Yes. Can you put the microphone on, perhaps, in front of you?
So my comment is about the second principle on consultation in the document. So where it says that governments must ensure that representatives of all interested parties are involved in the development of textual proposals, I noticed that only organizations and experts representing internet users and consumers have been specifically called out. I think it would be important to also name here that marginalized communities and development experts have to be involved. It might be important to add that as well.
Well, thank you for that. That was the way that that suggestion had been made before, and the way that we reached a compromise on that was actually to insert it into the, oopsie, I've just done something very bad. It's become very small. I don't know how I did that.
Just enlarge it just a second.
Anyway, let me get some help there. So the final one of the recommendations, which I'll read out here instead. Yeah, well, we'll see if we can do that. So the last of the recommendations says countries should make trade advice, blah, blah, blah. Take steps to include more diverse legitimate stakeholders such as representatives of internet users and organisations working in the areas of human rights, development, media and consumer issues. And the addition of those human rights and development organisations was in response to a comment like that. And so that was the way we tried to address that in this text. Yes, Sanya?
Thanks for this, and I'm sorry if I was supposed to give input on it earlier. I was busy with the trade negotiations. So I'm not sure whether this document is intended to be agnostic as to whether internet issues should be discussed in trade agreements, because, as you know, that's very controversial. The current proposals in the WTO, in addition to affecting about 13 different government ministries' areas of law, from financial regulation to competition and tax and health and everything with their e-commerce proposals, they are also issues that are prohibited from being negotiated in the Doha round, like stronger total prohibitions on technology transfer, which go beyond the TPP and so on, which is an investment issue that's not allowed to be negotiated in the WTO, TRIPS plus intellectual property protection for all WTO members, including least developed countries, immediately, when of course least developed countries don't have to do any intellectual property protection at the WTO, total liberalisation of government procurement, another issue that's not allowed to be negotiated in the Doha round. So a lot of developing countries, for example, feel that e-commerce is being used as a Trojan horse to bring in issues that they have previously rejected from the WTO as not being appropriate to their level of development. So it's not just about the internet per se. The TPP's government procurement, investment, telecoms and other chapters have been proposed without even the exceptions that are in the TPP in the name of e-commerce at the WTO. So I think you might get more buy-in to this declaration if it was agnostic as to whether trade agreements should discuss internet issues, because they're being used as a Trojan horse for all of these other things, and instead was more along the lines of, if you discuss these issues in trade agreements, then we insist on the following transparent process. And the particular provision in the document that I would highlight is in the preamble in the first paragraph. The second sentence says international trade agreements that support free and open internet are very good, basically, and that may be controversial for some because that's not been the outcome so far. The provisions on spam and consumer protection and so on and privacy have been totally weak and unenforceable, whereas those which are TRIPS plus intellectual property protection, restricting government regulators' ability to check source code that doesn't crash the stock market and so on, have been very strong and enforceable. So there may be some debate about that particular sentence, which doesn't reflect the reality so far of these kinds of provisions that have been put into trade agreements and moves away from being agnostic as to whether internet issues should be in trade agreements and instead tends to be that it looks optimistic that these issues should be in trade agreements. We could have a great outcome when in fact we know the privacy exception, for example, in the WTO is useless, it's self-cancelling, it's got a less than 1 out of 44 success rate, and there's no mandate to change it. And you see the outcome in the TPP and so on. There was no effective better privacy exception given the jurisprudence on legitimate and the chapeau of GATT and GATS, which was copied into the cross-border data flows provisions in the TPP e-commerce chapter. Thanks.
Thanks, Sonia. So that sentence has been highlighted on the overhead on the projector. I'll also read it out. This is one that has gone through a round of changes already, but I'm grateful for your input, and maybe if there are other views on the room about whether we want to maintain this as it is or change a word or two. I don't want to make wholesale changes here, but like if there's a word or two that we can do. Just in a minute, Parminder, I'm just going to read this out first. So the text says, international trade agreements that support the free and open internet and the interoperability of internet information services can assist member countries to harness the potential of the internet to promote social and economic development for all. So that's the sentence that Sonia's drawn attention to. Parminder, do you want to give a remark?
Yeah, I understand. I was there and I was trying to engage with all other aspects of this one, and I completely agree with Sania because, I mean, coming back to from WTO meeting, we should know that there is a huge amount of division, not only among countries on this issue, but also civil society, because the big civil society organizations present at WTO were against getting e-commerce in. Now, I'm not saying that we should take either one or the two, but just putting that context, that's the context of what we are talking about. So if we put some words there, one Sania is saying it, make it conditional if, and that's up for consideration, but free and open internet and just and fair and some development stuff, we make our normative conditions a little more expensive, which would include the concerns of those who, for those reasons, are not ready to start with e-commerce talks. We could probably then reach an agreement. And that should be non-controversial because we are just talking about just fair development, these kind of words, apart from the free and open and interoperable internet. So that's my suggestion.
Well, let me just propose something then. How about if you and Sonia could, while we go on to the next part of the agenda, you could just take a paper copy of this into a corner and suggest some amendments to that sentence, and then we can come back and see, like a show of hands in the room, do we prefer the amended version or do we prefer the original version? Does that sound like a way forward? Okay, thanks for that. So, any other comments on this? Yes, Norbert.
An alternative possibility for resolving this kind of problem, if wordsmithing should turn out to be difficult, might be to simply drop the preamble and jump right to principles, because I think we can probably agree on those.
Yeah, well, or just to drop that sentence, I think, rather than drop the whole preamble, we could simply drop that sentence. Yes, at the back?
Okay. I have a technical question about the data and the transparency. How can you protect, for example, the behavior of human? Because with the power of quantum computing and with the deep learning and the neural network, we can put on equation every single person on the earth. So how can we speak about transparency and trade when you have, for example, some country who have the ability to predict your consumer behavior, and the company who haven't this kind of technology? Where is the limit?
Well, that maybe leads us into the next phase of our meeting, because it doesn't seem to be a direct suggestion related to this text, but the next part of the meeting is about issues that we should be dealing with over the next year, and I think you've raised one. I think William Drake also mentioned that he would be able to talk about something that we could do over the coming year related to initiatives to link the trade and internet governance communities and discussions. Do you want to say anything about that, Bill?
So we just did a session prior to this, an UNCTAD Open Forum, where we focused on the challenge of bringing together the trade community and internet governance stakeholder communities in some sort of a process to be able to have greater cross-fertilization of ideas and get, hopefully, greater ability for people to articulate views and inputs in a way that would be actually useful in the governmental activities. And I think that that's a challenge we have to work on going forward here, irrespective of people's preferred outcomes. It is clear that there will be work done on developing trade language in various trade contexts. And I think we want to be able to bring together the range of stakeholders that have been participating in multi-stakeholder settings to be able to provide more effective input. Now, one stop along the way for that could be UNCTAD's e-commerce week, which comes up in April. I think it's April 16 to 20. And we might consider whether or not between now and then something could be done to try to build something of a process that would outreach to some more players, bring them in, and do some sort of a session there. And I think probably Torbjorn would be open to something like that happening at UNCTAD. I think more generally, just in terms of the dynamic coalition itself and the broader ODTN, I think, you know, if you looked at the slide you put up there at the beginning with the pie chart on the participation, I mean, we're cheating a little bit, because if you count the academics as civil society, in fact, it's a very largely civil society-oriented group thus far. And I know David's here, but I mean, we need to get more engagement from people in the internet technical community and the internet business community if this is going to be a dynamic coalition in the tradition of the dynamic coalitions of IGF, which are truly multi-stakeholder. I want to point out also that we have a member of the European Parliament here in the room who's been very involved in shaping the European Parliament initiative on digital trade issues. We also have the WTO here, if people actually want to know how some of these things work, just hiding in the back. So we might try to think about how we could sort of open up these conversations a little bit more and think about how to take them forward in a more constructive way. I think having started, and I will stop, having started with the question of transparency, which is a process issue, was a good choice, because as we found throughout the WSIS process, whenever you start to get into the substantive issues, you start to have disagreements. And as was said at the UNCTAD session by Milton Mueller, within civil society, we're not all on the same page about a lot of the substantive policy issues, but we all, I think, generally agree that trade processes, if they proceed, must be done in a more transparent way. So building on the process stuff, I think, is a good place to start.
Thank you very much, Bill. I agree 100% with everything you've said there. Does anyone else want to respond either to what Bill has said or to raise something else? 1, 2. 1, 2, 3.
Rolf Weber. I only would like to make maybe a strategic comment. If I look at the 5 recommendations, then I think that the first bullet point is the most unrealistic recommendation. And the question is always whether you want to start with the unrealistic one. So eventually I would propose to start with bullet point 3 and 4 and then move to 1 and 2. It's, as I said, only a question of reshuffling.
Sure, that doesn't sound unreasonable. What do people think? Oh, Sonia's waving her hand frantically. I think we've got another couple of people in the queue, but let's come back to you after that, Sonia. Or is this a direct response to the suggestion? Okay, why don't you jump in then?
Sorry, if you're proposing to delete the first recommendation?
No, just to reorder it.
Reorder. Actually, the first one is quite mild. This is what the EU is already doing. The European Union, I think since their ombudsman said that they should, has been publishing their own textual proposals in free trade agreements, including on e-commerce. So we see it for Mexico, Tunisia, Indonesia, and so on. So this is current state practice. So I don't know that we should be less radical than some governments are already doing. But sure, if you want to put the last one first, but the first one is already state practice by some governments.
Okay, well, in the event that there's objection to reordering it, I'm proposing we just maybe leave it as is. Now, we had two other hands up. Parminder, did you have your hand up? Or was that just to bring back the work that you and...
No, that's... Okay. Yeah, so, yeah, it's a back and forth. I wanted to talk on process about the DC, but following on what Drake said, that we can focus on the process. But if we are now insisting on talking about the resolution, then I can come in later. It's not about the resolution.
No, we'll return to that in a couple of minutes, but you can make a more general remark.
No, and I agree that, see, in a multi-stakeholder dynamic coalition on an issue which is about economy, about trade, I'm not really expecting that we would have great agreements, civil society from the South, agreeing with the big industry on trade of all things. We could have agreed on, interoperability of internet and many other issues at the IGF, but this is one of the most difficult ones. But no reason, therefore, not to have a dynamic coalition still. But then the process becomes most important. What is it that we can sit together and talk and help each other understand things, and I think that would remain the focus and not substantive outcomes which are going to be difficult.
Yeah.
And in this regard, I just want to put in an issue that we should, as a process, recognize that those who, we've in IGF follow the politics of presence. If you are there, then that's all which matters in the world, and those who are not here, well, sorry for you guys. But that's a problem because that's not how representation works. Again, at WTO, there's a huge number of countries who were not for trade negotiations. And especially the African group had very cogent papers. They were not just saying, no, we don't understand it. They're very cogent papers on why they aren't here. So we need to keep, the keeping of balance of perspective is going to be important. And even in case of industry, we were working in India. We had a joint press conference where there was the small traders and Manufacturers Association, which has 17,000 sub-associations. Each of that association has thousands of members who gave a press conference that they do not want WTO to be talking about e-commerce at this moment. And we're talking about millions of industries then. And those industries are typically not represented. So my just small point is that in the process, we remember that just those who are present do not represent everyone, and take a very conscious effort to see that these are the views. A lot of people have it, but only few of them may be present here. And that balance would be very important as the process goes forward. I just wanted to put it on record. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. And given that we only have a few minutes remaining, let's take this and this here, and then maybe we can go to your amendments to the resolution. So go ahead, please. Okay.
Yeah, Bill inspired me to say a few words. Just first, I don't know about FTAs and RTAs and their transparency. I have to usually, even though I work in the WTO, go to WikiLeaks like the rest of you to see what's going on in the bilateral or regional agreements. As far as the WTO goes, from its starting point, it's actually done a lot in recent years to be more transparent, specifically on e-commerce. Every single government that's put in a paper for the last 2 years has essentially put them in, asking us to make it a public document from the start, and that's a little unusual in our traditions. So I think there are some good signs about being more transparent. More importantly, I guess we have a tradition that dies hard that we expect governments to do these kind of open consultations in capital and bring us a position that takes into account all these views. And in fact, through our technical assistance, we usually find that there is a multi-stakeholder group. It might not be as broad as you're thinking of in capitals that are used to consult for negotiations. They often have many agencies and many trade associations and sometimes consumer groups. I think that the WTO is trying. They're doing a lot that they weren't doing before. There's one thing you said, that you read something about commenting, making things available for comment before. Mm-hmm. What's that wording again? Because I had a specific comment.
So domestic consultations on textual proposals should be opened up to the public, blah, blah, blah. Public hearing processes at relevant points during the development of textual proposals. So this is about the domestic consultations.
Yeah, so it's the same level at which making... we've been trying in the services agreement to get some domestic regulatory disciplines that it would actually obligate governments to publish proposed whatever before they are enter into force, so that there can be public comment. And so far we've been unsuccessful. Not so much because people don't like this kind of concept, but because there's this, again, this political trade-off where some people are saying, well, you want this one, but you don't want another provision that we want. Yeah. So we've been having that on precisely this issue for a number of years in our discussions on how to improve domestic regulatory environment.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to have to cut short the discussion. I'm really sorry about this, because we wanted to have a 90-minute session. We only got a 1-hour session. So I'm going to turn back to either Sanya or Parminder to suggest their amendments to the resolution.
We actually just emailed them to you in case you wanted to project somehow, but basically... Oh,
you did? Okay. Oh, yes, I see. Sorry, I didn't see that. So Sanya is saying it's easiest to drop that particular sentence because otherwise it could require heavy negotiation. If we can't just drop it, some minimalist changes to improve it, she said, would be if international trade agreements support a free and open internet, which is fair and development-oriented and furthers the interoperability of internet information services, that could assist member countries to harness the potential of the internet to promote social and economic development for all. So I'm going to paste that into the document, and we can view those. Is it big enough? Yeah, let's see. We can view those two sentences side by side, and then I'm just going to ask for a show of hands as to whether we want the original one or the revised one. So bear with me. Yeah, or to drop it. So those are the three choices. From what I'm hearing from the room, I'm not hearing any strong disagreement with the statement as a whole. So let's just firstly go through, do we want the first option, the second option, or neither of them? And then I'll call for, like, by acclamation, let's approve the statement with whatever amendment we've suggested to the preamble. So option one, the original reading is international trade agreements. Well, you can see it, and then the proposed revision is if international trade agreements support a free and open internet that could assist member countries to harness the potential of the internet. So let's call that option one, option two, and option three is delete that sentence. So a show of hands for option one, which is the original text. A few. Option two, the revised text, show of hands. Option three, deletion. Ooh, that's close. I'm going to have to count. Let's do that again. Oh. Yeah, but we really want to, I think we're so close. Let's just push it through. So I think it was between options 2 and 3. So let's do options 2 again, show of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And option 3 is deletion. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I think we have the revised version of Sanya, so I'm going to delete that first one. can we then say that the inaugural meeting of the Dynamic Coalition on Trade and the Internet has endorsed by rough consensus this resolution on transparency? Yes? Anyone against? Congratulations, I think we have a rough consensus there. So we've finished right on the dot of 11:40. Wish we had longer, but thank you very much for coming. If you're not a member of the list, and I particularly would like to invite our WTO friend, and I can help you with that. And anyone else that you know, particularly if you have contacts in government or in the tech community, please encourage them to join. So thank you very much indeed for coming along this morning.
Thank you.
Oh, and take an apple tart if you contributed. This is your reward for contributing.
I'll take one for Sandhya. You should know. There's a comma missing, Sandhya's saying.
She's saying what?
She's saying there's a comma missing.
Oh, okay. We can fix that. Hello. Hi. Yeah. Yes, indeed.
In fact, I should have been the chair for your dividends presentation, but you were late.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You were late.
Yeah.
And I had to leave at 10:30.
Oh.
Your presentation only started at 10:30, so
Sorry.
minute took over, but
Yeah.
of course I have read your paper. I just want to say I'm not yet a member of the DC. I didn't realize that it exists. But I'm going to subscribe to the
including a permission in trade
since I'm involved in WTO
overlooks that entire
Oh, perfect.
since 95, and I mean, I was involved in
Wonderful.
electronic commerce. I published a lot to the issues which are backed by papers, but I didn't
Great.
vote because I'm not formally a member.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Glad you can join.
I really I have the feeling that I could bring in input from both sides.
Perfect. That's what we need. Perfect. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
If it doesn't, if you give me a card,
Hi.
I'll send you some more
Produce the
Otherwise, I can just list down your email ID.
Well, maybe I can give you my card and I can send you the link if you email me. And there you go.
should be interesting the perspective of
Just tell me your
trade
email address.
regulation.
SAI.
Indeed.
I think that I can contribute.
Great.
Sorry, let me write.
In the next project will be on what
Well, we had a little discussion there. It was a bit rushed, but Bill Drake, the gentleman in the pink shirt, has suggested what one of the things we can do to try and link in with the WTO and the